Hey everybody, how's it going? Thanks for joining me this afternoon. Got a great stream with a guest I think you're really going to enjoy. Now, Inez Stepman is someone who I have interacted with on Twitter a bunch, but I had never got completely into some of her work. And then I saw an article that she put out here in the recent week, which I thought was really interesting, took a very good tack on kind of what's happening with Elon Musk and Twitter and all that that's going on right now. So I wanted to invite her on and kind of have a conversation, maybe learn a little more about her work. She is a podcaster. She's the host of the High Noon podcast, and she's also a policy analyst. Inez, thanks for coming on.
Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. So the article that you had here was on Elon Musk and his takeover of Twitter, and a lot of people have focused on the free speech aspect of this, which I think is pretty understandable. I mean, that was Elon's kind of stated goal, or at least one of his major stated goals. Everyone makes the joke about the Babylon Bee getting banned, and that kind of being the domino that leads to the revolution. But I think there was some truth to that. But the thing that you focused a lot on was not so much the battle for free speech, though I think we'll talk about kind of how these things are connected, but you focused on kind of how Elon is gutting the bureaucracy over at Twitter and kind of challenging the preconceptions of many in the tech industry of kind of the support structure you need that kind of reinforces a lot of ideology. Could you go into that a little more?
Yeah, I think the roots of this are really sort of James Burnham style analysis that now seems so prophetic to so many of us, looking around at how both economic and political power is structured. And so, really, fundamentally, I think this is a more substantive challenge in some way to the professional managerial class, and therefore the ideas that they're able to effectuate, both through public policy and through private economic power, right? So I think the free speech, and we can get into this, the free speech parameters are set by these people. Like, that's the problem. We've always had parameters around what was considered acceptable free speech, right? It was never actually good for your career in America to tattoo a swastika on your forehead and then try to go work at, Dollar General, right?
Right.
This was always bad for you. And I think Michael Knowles has done a good job laying out why there always have been some parameters around free speech, even if in America we have very strong legal protections against government interference into free speech. So I think these things are all related, because the problem is this political class and this particular sort of professional class that has very, very similar ideas. They mostly agree with each other culturally. They're coming out of the same university system, that both reinforces and sometimes introduces those ideas and makes them sort of homogenized. Um, and the real question, I think, for Elon Musk is not a political radical, right? I'm under no sort of illusion that Elon Musk is our champion of the right wing billionaire or whatever it is. But what he is a tough boss. And what he is looking for value from his employees. And I think what he's starting to prove with Twitter is something more dangerous than allowing Kanye West back on to tweet a swastika or whatever it is, right?
Mhm.
I think what he's proving is that a lot of these people who are making very, very good money, essentially enforcing political diktat, their jobs are ideologically justified. And he's basically saying, you know what? I can take a third of the company who are actually the ones who are producing the value, the enormous value that these American tech companies are producing. Maybe it's coming from a small sector within that, mostly, male, mostly white and Asian, right? Politically correct inconveniences there. Um, and maybe we don't need this entire class of people who are credentialed through the University of Pennsylvania, like Yoel Roth, or through Harvard or through Yale, but don't actually add a lot of substance to the bottom line. Because in the end of the day, there isn't a lot of. I think what I wrote in my piece was, this kind of ideological policing doesn't add to the wealth of nations at the end of the day, and it's all kind of this house of cards of BS. And I think calling a lot of like essentially calling out a lot of the fact that this quote unquote value that is making a lot of people real billions, right, isn't actually resting on anything. It's an economic house of cards. So that I think that might be very, very important. That example might be very, very important, especially as we do go in potentially to a recession and a contraction of the tech sector.
Yeah, I think those are really good points because, as you started to say at the beginning there, I think I'm not the free speech champion. I'm not saying it doesn't matter, but I'm not the person who's the free speech absolutist. I think the idea that yeah, there have always been boundaries. There will always be cultural norms about what you can say and what you can approach, and some of those might even be healthy, but the ones that are being imposed right now are rather artificial and come from like you said, that ideology that's very harmful and produces a lot of baggage. I really like the phrase you use, the Homer Simpson job, right? Like a lot of these people are coming in, they're there to hold a place, they're there to tick a box. Their job doesn't as you say in the piece, there's a lot of scaffolding. A lot of our economy is warped around producing make work jobs for these people even though they're not adding anything significant, and this creates the elevation of guys like Yoel Roth who otherwise wouldn't have any particular value in an economy, has done some work that most people would pay almost no attention to, but is instead granted the ability to censor the president of the United States. From what we can tell, that's an insane amount of power given to someone who otherwise probably wouldn't be very impressive. And that's a very powerful tool of like political patronage. That's something that will pretty much guarantee someone is on your side forever if you can kind of invert the hierarchy and put people like that at the top and make sure that they have power over like a president of the United States. Those people are going to be ride and die for you forever, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I really think Yoel Roth is just this sort of quintessential example of someone of this type who's been very, very successful, right? So most of these people are not as successful as Yoel Roth. They don't have as high positions in the company. They truly are this professional class, which, by the way, Daryl E. Paul, I think, writes fantastically about this. And he's pointed out that the margin for quote unquote socialism on the left has shrunk, right? So it used to be tax the rich, but what defines the rich is essentially moving with the boundaries of the professional class, right? So now if you have two income household both making, let's say, $200,000, you end up with a $400,000 yearly income for a family. That's now not rich, right? So we're moving the
Mm.
boundaries. It's always that teeny tiny 1%. We want to tax the Elon Musks to death, but the professional class is very, very good at protecting itself from the kind of broad-based taxation, say in Sweden, for example, right? Where not only the middle class, but the professional class as well is all heavily taxed for the welfare state. I do think that's just like an interesting thing to point out that this really is the base of the Democratic Party now, is this professional class. Um, but yeah, I mean, I think that the Yoel Roth is just this perfect example. What has Yoel Roth actually done? We just assume that people like Yoel Roth are worth their very, very large paychecks because they have the right credentials. Well, what are those credentials? At this point, they're purely ideological, right? I quote in my piece extensively from his LinkedIn account, right, which is just basically his resume. There's nothing on his resume that doesn't have to do exactly with these ideological concerns, and of course, they're very narcissistic and self-referential, right? He did his dissertation basically on his own sex life on Grinder, right? Um, and it's not at all clear, and this is why I think Musk is so important. Like from the actual capital perspective, from that like CEO C-suite perspective, basically what they've been told is you have to hire a lot of these people and give them great perks and great salaries because they came out of the right universities and because of these like, sort of nebulous sort of platitudinal level justifications, right? So it's like if you don't hire these people, then your employees will not be productive because they won't feel actualized at work. And there are therapeutic justifications as well, right? You won't, if you don't have enough diversity on your staff, then you're going to suffer. Your ideas are going to suffer because you won't have the different perspectives. And these are all sort of platitudinal. And I think what Elon Musk is doing is essentially saying that might not be true, right? There may be
Yeah.
absolutely no economic value. And in fact, you might have a very fat payroll of people making six figures, not like small salaries, right? Maybe not Yoel Roth level salaries, but six-figure salaries, very nice living, and an enormous amount of power to impose their views on the rest of the country that is given to them by that economic might that is really created by a small group of people within the company, most of whom are uninterested in this kind of stuff. So I do think this is perhaps, if he can pull this off, and I think they're going to try everything to make sure he doesn't. Um, if he can pull this off, it may not be the free speech functions that are the most important. It may just be that example sitting over there to other CEOs saying, you know what, you don't have to be held hostage by these people. You don't have to be held hostage by your professional employees, right? You can actually fire a lot of these people because at the end of the day, only a small percentage of them are actually doing much that's adding to your bottom line.
Yeah, and it would be really great to see the free market pick up a W like that, because it's taken quite a lot of L's here recently. So it would be great if we actually saw a free market force work in that way. But I do think you're right that it does, having this stuff stripped away and still having everything operate fine and actually become more profitable. If even if it doesn't force other CEOs to change their behavior, it truly lays bare kind of the ideological structure of the regime, right? Like, we look at these people. Well, actually, let me ask you this, because I don't know how familiar you are with James Burnham, but you did cite him in the piece, so I'm sure you're familiar. So the managerial class is supposed to gain its indispensability by its ability to operate the bureaucracy, right? Like, that's why bourgeoisie hand over the reins of power to the managerial class, because they can operate massified structures in a way that the business owners could not. But it's really interesting that that wokeness becomes kind of its own cottage industry, its own sub function of managerial status, where at least before, the managerial elite were in theory operating a bureaucracy that did produce benefits, right? Like, you were actually able to streamline production and deliver products and these kind of things. But now the managerial subset has created not a product at all. It's just ideological compliance. And so it's interesting that it's almost like the managerial elite transitioned over to a Leninist aspect, where you're just placing commissars inside your corporation to make sure you have compliance like you would IRS tax compliance. They're not actually operating the functions of the bureaucracy the way that the managerial elite are actually supposed to do in order to gain their status and power.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. There are economic, and as Byrne pointed out, right, there's a reason that we transferred away from a kind of Wild West capitalism more towards this managerial economy, and that's because it was offering real benefits, right? There was a lot of problems with it as well, but there was at the end of the day, this was making money. There was a value here, and that's, I think, where we are at a tipping point in that regard, where this managerial class has essentially dealt themselves a huge amount of power in terms of public policy, a huge amount of influence in terms of cultural direction of the country that is very much contrary to what the average or average citizen, like voting citizen, thinks, right? Um, and at the end of the day, it's very much no longer clear that they are actually even producing anything at the end except for that compliance. And so I think this is a interesting tipping point. We're going to see, either we're going to tip over into just the absolute exercise of power, right? Where they no longer have to justify the exercise of that ideological power through any other means. Because right now, I think ESG is a really good example, actually. Um, ESG, they have to have right now in financially, right, and legally, they have to have this economic explanation for why it doesn't hurt, right? Why
Mhm.
it's actually better to invest in ESG funds, and there's no hurt on your bottom line. In fact, it might be better for your bottom line, and they have all kind of statistical manipulations to show that that's true, right? I don't know that it would be as successful without those platitudes. And if those platitudes are convincingly disproven, because that's the thing about this kind of work, right? This kind of professional work, it's not always clear whether somebody is actually producing something of value or not, right? Because it's not like you get paid $1 per widget, right, that you're making, and at
Right.
the end of the day you have a pile of widgets and you get your paycheck, right? It's not hourly. These are project based. They're somewhat creative. They're non-repetitive, right? These kinds of jobs. There's a lot of room, frankly, for BS in this. And into that BS has essentially stepped this ideology and this ideological, explicitly ideological credentialing. But I think, again, the Twitter counterexample might show that that's all there is there.
Mhm.
that there isn't that end of the day, that actual value being produced. And look, it may take quite a while because America's very rich, right? That's another reason why we can get away with a lot of this stuff. That wealth covers for a lot of garbage, right? So yeah, I mean, I think you're right. Either we're going to tip into the direct exercise of power in like sort of a direct Leninist way, right, where they're going to say, yes, we have this power because we are right, and we're going to apply it to get the results that we want, regardless of any other justifications. But what we have right now is this kind of hybrid thing where you're doing well by doing good, right?
Right.
And I think Elon Musk has the potential to disprove the doing well part, and we'll see what happens once that knowledge sort of seeps into the private sector.
Yeah, and I think that's a really significant victory. That's why I thought your piece had such a good angle, because so often in the free speech debate, the key everyone thinks is, you just get X amount of people on your side, right? Like you convince so many people that it's more important to be able to say the truth than it is to comply with these things, and the scales will tip. But I think what people need to understand is that most people didn't just decide one day to wake up and lie about whether like men could become women, or like who's really good at computer programming. I think that those things happen because there's a slow and steady incentive process built into the system that kind of requires people to constantly, tell themselves these lies. And if you strip out the patronage, if you strip out the rewards for people A, parroting this stuff, and B, basically having jobs that exist only to run around and punish people for not parroting this stuff, then you will see a decent amount of reality reassert itself. And so, in many ways, the stripping out of these patronage jobs, I think, is far more essential to the battle of free speech than the actual ideological debate around like whether the First Amendment is an absolute right in private sectors or something. Like, I like, while those discussions are important, I think people need to understand that like the actual abolition of the apparatus is far more valuable in this battle than like winning the debate club thing about whether we should have free speech or not.
Yeah, I mean, look, you get what you incentivize institutionally. You're going to get
Hmm.
more of it. That's a fact of human nature. Are you going to have dissidents? Yes. Is everybody going to be Solzhenitsyn? No. Right? You only have one or two or a handful, right? Meeting in cafes, um, and or anonymously on the internet. Um, no, but you're fundamentally you're going to get more of what the power structure rewards. Because people are self-interested, and that's not necessarily like a terrible thing. It just is, right? Um, and yeah, I think you're right that in fact, if you remove the reward structure for a lot of this stuff, you'll get a lot less of it. Not none of it, right? You
Right.
do have your true believers, and there are, I think, there's a generational component here. The younger your employees are, the more likely they're true believers in this stuff, right? Because they've been raised in within the parameters of the narrative that we currently live under. They don't really. I gotta say, at some level, they must know that some of these things are not true just because they directly contradict. And here I'm going to use the left, lived experience. Uh,
Yeah.
but on the other hand, ideology has the ability to convince you. I'm not going to use the overused final command of the party, the 2 + 2 = 5 kind of stuff. But I think it applies here, right? The power of ideological indoctrination, which is really what it is for like the lower half of millennials and Gen Z, right? They're really born into this, where basically since kindergarten, this is largely what's being taught. Some version
Yeah.
of this has been taught by all official organs that are given any kind of honors in society, right? If you are a good student, you know this stuff very well, right? If you do well in life, you know this stuff very well. But yes, it is inseparable from that reward and that path to the good life, and that path to both money and power, but also honors and societal sort of approval and status, right? So all of these things are very important to people as they should be. Um, I do think actually what you're referring to is the winning the debate argument. I also think that's generational. I think what we're seeing is the last defections from Gen X, right? The people who are center or even left on the left in the 90s, right? Elon Musk probably falls into this category, right? You have a lot of like these Gen X folks who just weren't fully indoctrinated, but they're not conservative. They're just sort of not of the new left, and you're
They're
seeing an
neocons, yeah.
accelerated, yeah, like you're seeing an accelerated move of these people out of the left because they're right. It has nothing to do with the ideas that they believed in. Although they're related, actually, I wouldn't say nothing to do, but that's a topic for another day, but um, fundamentally, I think we're seeing the last defections of a generation that wasn't fully indoctrinated, and that gives people, I think, a false sense of security because they feel like everyone around them is starting to wake up to this stuff, but they're not factoring in the new rank of graduates every year into every single one of these powerful institutions, and those people are not questioning whether we're going too far with wokeness. They're on the leading edge. In fact, I wouldn't be surprised if like the woke language started to separate by tier of university, right? So like if you went to Harvard, that certain words are no longer acceptable. Versus if you went to Brown, you might not know that, right? Like it might
Yeah.
literally class stratify like accents in the UK. You know what I mean? Be able to tell what school someone went to by what set of woke languages they use. But uh, that might be a bit of an exaggeration, but
I don't
something
think
to
it
think
is at
about.
all, honestly. No, I think we already see this, right? Like we already see wokeness as a way to settle like internecine disputes inside the left, and they're already using it to stratify. You it was okay to be progressive, but now you need to start stacking modifiers. So if you're a white guy in tech, you better figure out how to get, I don't know, trans, or you better figure out how to become two spirit or something. Like you need to figure out some kind of ideological niche in order to make sure that you stratify yourself away from the untouchables. And so I think that you're only going to see that purity spiral increase. I think there's a high likelihood that being on the bleeding edge of wokeness will continue to be, the code switching, the jargon rearrangement will continue until they can make sure that they're very safe, kind of in that pattern. So I don't think that's a ridiculous thing to kind of believe, but I do think it's a really important point about conservatives and just those who oppose progressives not understanding like what's coming up behind them. C.S. Lewis, in The Abolition of Men, talks about how once you have an entire generation that's completely socially engineered away from basically all human instincts, that will be the abolition of man. Like there will no longer be kind of the natural ties to what made humans human. You won't have that instinct to return back to the kind of the things that made you whole. And people don't understand that, while, like you said, the Gen Xers, the kind of the final defections of those who still had a way back to kind of that existence that was there before the woke indoctrination, as that kind of falls away, the next generation just does not have that built in. They don't have those instincts. They have swam in the waters of deep progressive ideological indoctrination their entire lives. And so there isn't this innate pull back to the truth and kind of the natural beauty of human existence. So I think that is a huge issue for people, because this is something I keep trying to explain to those that are like for the pure free speech crowd, the people who think that, well, if we can just get the ideological stuff out of there, if we can just get people back to like a safe and neutral application of policies and rules, everything will be fine. But one of the reasons that like stripping out the bureaucracy is so important is that at the end of the day, it's not really about the rules, it's about who decides on the rules, right? Like at the end of the day, you can change the technical terms of the Twitter, censorship agreements. You can change the user policies. You can clarify the procedures, but the people operating them at the end of the day are the ones that actually make the decisions. And if it's full of woke commissars, it doesn't really matter if you clarify that language and try to provide some level of some level of accountability. These people are ultimately going to be able to manipulate the procedure in the way that will always produce the outcome they're hoping for.
Yeah, this is also why I think so some of the conservatives who are calling for essentially the application of the tactics to some degree of the left. Sometimes I think that's a good idea. Um, Sometimes I think it's really naive. And in regard, especially so, like they imagine that they can call like a couple of these bureaucrats to the carpet, right? And we can get rid of certain, like for example, within the FBI, right? Like we can fire a couple people at the top. They imagine that it is like fundamentally still that power is still flowing through the natural ways, or not natural, but the American system, right? And the
The
reality
formal
is,
systems, yeah.
yeah, the formal system, and the reality is those rules will not be applied, right? You can tell the DOJ to go after their own. They're going to do that in a very different way. And they're
Mhm.
going to slow walk it, and maybe you'll get a scalp or two out of it, but you're not going to fundamentally change the institution until you change the incentive structure, which is why I think one of the most important things is to be able to do mass firing in federal government, and to be able to put federal employees at will, as opposed to, I mean, we have about 110 years at this point. Actually, let me see. The first civil service, you can say the Pendleton Act in 1883. I mean, we have this very thick web of essentially job protections for federal employees that protect them, not only from being fired, but also like there's very little you can do to them, right? You can kind of move them into a different department, which is usually like a lateral move. You really can't even promote on the basis of well, merit for one, but also whether or not they're actually carrying out the objectives of the elected officials. So something systemic has to actually shift so that we can actually go into these departments and affect policy change. Because I think the clearest example is the Trump administration, and people, I really get annoyed when both the left and like the sort of whatever you can call it, the David French right, say, well, oh, like the head of the FBI that Trump appointed is a Trump FBI, right? Like, so how can you say that they were going after the right? Well, because the rest of the FBI is not controlled by the president.
Mhm.
Um, None of these agencies are actually controlled by the president. This is very obvious. Um, and for most of the people making those arguments, they know it, right? They know that these executive agencies, and the administrative state is effectively an arm of the Democratic Party. It's effectively a neoliberal position. Now, if you had somebody like Bernie Sanders on the left, the bureaucracies might fight him too. It's possible. I mean, I'm not a Sanders fan, obviously, but like it, his particular brand, or at least before he sort of walked his way back into the neoliberal fold, he might also have trouble implementing some of his policies. But for the most part, the bureaucracy hums happily going after the enemies of the left, right? It will not hum easily for us, even if we tried to use the same tactics. If we tried to direct the FBI to, you know, do some of the horrible things that it's done to Donald Trump, to for example, to Biden, so to investigate Hunter Biden or whatever it is. It won't work for us because we don't fundamentally control these institutions, and this professional class is overwhelmingly one direction. So 95% of the donations from federal employees in 2016 went to Hillary Clinton, right? So
Yeah.
it's like a faculty lounge. It's like trying to implement your policy in a faculty lounge. Like you're not going to get very far. I did want to make 2 points to, because I think you made a good point about like swimming in the ether when you're young
Mhm,
and
mhm.
you don't really know anything outside of this indoctrination. I think there is an element of hyper novelty in tech here as well that makes a lot of this stuff seem, it makes the hard barriers of reality a little softer, right?
Yeah.
If your primary identity is digital, it becomes much more. And I'm not the first person to observe that there's a connection between transgenderism and transhumanism, right? Or that primary identity online. But I think it's much easier to imagine that certain things could be true than even 20 years ago, right? And then the other thing is, look, things that are contrary to reality will eventually come to a hard stop. Um, it's true that what is the Horace quote? Like, you can chase nature out with a pitchfork, and yet she keeps hurrying back. Like, human nature will reassert itself, and some boundaries of reality will reassert itself. But you can isolate yourself with tech and money for a very long time, and that's not really a comfort to me, as I don't intend to live 500 years. Okay, the USSR lasted almost 100. Okay, like this may be a comfort in sort of the theological sense or whatever theological sense, but it's not an actual comfort for us right here, because our generation, our children's generation, and perhaps our grandchildren's generation could potentially live under a system that is tyrannical and contrary to any boundaries of reality. Like, that's totally possible. We could isolate ourselves in that way from the consequences of reality for 100 years.
Yeah, and I think that's really, a lot of people kind of in my sphere will have this, well, everything will inevitably come around, right? Eventually the wheel will turn and reality will reassert itself, and, things will crumble. And I think that's true. I think, you're exactly right to point out that those things will happen inevitably. But yeah, we can put that off for a long time, especially as a nation. Like that's one of the things I liked in the piece. You point out how much of our GDP is dedicated to ignoring reality, right? Like the how large our economy, how much of our economy, how big a percentage of what we do is basically there to simply deny, the truth, natural truths, that and keep them from reasserting themselves. And as we get further and further into this, as we create more and more of these systems and make more and more of we dedicate more and more of our brightest minds, and even our mid-tier minds, into the maintenance of systems that completely deny reality, the less likely we are to do anything of importance, and the worse life is probably going to get for a lot of people. I think you're also right that things like tech will lead people into this mindset far more easily. This is Pareto's type 1 residues, where like these are the people who are best at combinations and recreating boundaries. They don't have a lot of respect for established forms, that kind of thing. And these are the people who are always going to predominate in classes like tech or entertainment. Creative endeavors are going to be dominated by these people. So it is easy to live in that land for a very long time. But I think that kind of brings us to another aspect of this, something that you mentioned at the beginning with Musk and kind of his reassertion of reality onto his company, right? When he cuts a large chunk of his company, many people, like yourself, notice that he left a lot of men, especially white and Asian men, right, in the company.
Pakistani, yeah.
Those are the people who he identified as those that are essential to the operation of the company. That's a big problem for our society, not just for people on the left, but for people on the right as well, right? Like, there are a lot of people, I think, who are really uncomfortable with what happens if a business does address its staffing to optimize its output, to increase its ability to run on a smaller staff. And the truth is, a lot of these make work jobs also create, jobs for favored classes, those that have been enshrined in our, society as those that have to be put into these positions, even if they are not going to routinely achieve those kind of positions on their own. And I think that's a really uncomfortable thing for a lot of people. And I think it's something that will probably keep a lot of CEOs from following Elon Musk's lead, because even if he does pull this off for a while, eventually you can imagine, lawsuits and social pressure are going to come. I don't think a large chunk of corporate America is going to be okay with drastically changing the demographics of their companies, after all of kind of the propaganda and other possible, lawsuits that they might open themselves up to if they do this.
Yeah, I was gonna say, it's not just propaganda, right? It's the law.
It's baked
Um,
in, yeah.
it's civil rights law. So let's separate these two things. They're not totally separable, but there's sex and then there's race, right?
Sure.
And on with regard to sex, I think it's pretty clear that one of the unpredicted consequences of sort of our managerial shift that Burnham wrote about is that, in large part, this class is sexed, right? It's women.
Mhm.
Uh, Now, there are plenty of men that fall into this category, of course, but I'm saying overall, it seems like the boot stomping on the human face forever is more of a, like, sensible kitten heel or something. But in any case, it is a sexed class, right? Women predominate these kinds of jobs, and we write about this all the time. Even the center left or some folks at AEI, right? We write about this as in an economic sense, when manufacturing, direct manufacturing declines, right, and the so-called service economies, or service industries or whatever are on the rise. These are largely managerial jobs. For example, health administration, right? Knowing how to code things so that you can bill Medicare, like, that's an overwhelmingly female job. Um, So that's one aspect of this. In both cases, the race and the sex case, you have enormous incentives in civil rights law, right? And I really think, and I've heard that Chris Caldwell is working on an update to this because he recognizes this deficit. He just didn't get to it in his
Mm,
book. But I really do think the changes in the 90s are underrated in
mm,
terms of our civil rights law and the incentives they created. I don't think we had nearly as big of this kind of problem. And in fact, I kind of disagree, at least on the edges, with Chris Caldwell's book, in that I think a small percentage of the changes that he's observing rightly today, I think came between 1964 and the 1990s. And a large percentage of those changes came after the 1990s. Well, why is that? Well, we made a couple key changes in the 90s, signed by H.W. Bush, of course, who I must say initially resisted doing this. But there were sort of several rounds of this bill, and his party had voted for it, and he kind of he capitulated and signed the bill. So two of those major changes, one, no cap, I mean, vastly expanded cap on the kind of damages, right, that you can sue for this kind of like workplace discrimination. Right. There were pretty strict caps on it. There was a limit to what essentially the aggrieved employee could collect from his company. That limit was vastly extended. Right. So it became a much more painful tool to use against companies. But even more important is, and this came in the sexual harassment context first, and moved into the race context. As far as I know, I got to check with my colleague Jennifer Braceras, who's really she did employment law, so she's really an expert in this stuff. Um, but so I think it moved from sexual harassment and sex case into the racial case. But basically, the offense, legally speaking, I'm not now talking about, although they're related, the sort of emotional offense, but
mm,
the offense doesn't have to be. It used to have to be objectively offensive, sustained over time, and like basically endorsed by the company. Right. So you couldn't sue your company for sexual harassment as opposed to the particular person. You could not sue the company for sexual harassment because one guy was repeatedly asking you out, like a colleague or whatever it is. Right. Um, Now, after the 90s, you can. Um, and more than that, you can sue for hostile workplace environment or for discrimination if one guy has a bikini calendar on his desk and another coworker made an off-colored joke one time, right? And you said something to HR one time and nothing came of it, right? Like you can cobble together a lawsuit and over a series of like offenses that have nothing to do with each other, and they may be very very minor, right? And
mhm.
still collect a huge settlement. That gives companies exactly an incentive to make sure that no one could possibly be offended, right? No person, no single employee, it makes an eggshell skull kind of rule for everybody, right? Like if a single employee is offended by anything, if they can actually cobble together a lawsuit from all these things, and the dollar amounts rewards are quite high. So companies became very afraid of this, and this is when all this kind of trainings, like workplace training, started to take off, right? The sexual harassment trainings, the very funny ones that like you put in with the CD-ROM, right, in the 90s. But that has melded, I think, in a particularly tyrannical way with the advancement of sort of therapeutic culture, and with the ideological strictness with microaggressions, with blah 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 blah. Right. So I really think we're underrating how much of this happened in the 90s, and the enormous financial incentives that corporations had to make sure that nobody could possibly be offended at work.
Yeah, I think you're right that a lot of that accelerated in the 90s, but I would side with Caldwell saying that the groundwork was all there beforehand. The infrastructure, both legally and culturally, required to allow kind of that expansion needed to be there before we saw it take off. I think you're right that the acceleration really happens there. I mean, well then let me ask you this: what are the forces of the 90s that you think brings that upon the culture? We have a lot of people, who kind of do Breitbart's famous culture is downstream from politics. A lot of us around here prefer to say that culture is downstream from power. What do you think brings about those? Why is the 90s this crucial hinge in the switch?
So first of all, I always have to defend Breitbart because I was there when he was making those remarks, and I
Mhm.
knew him a little bit, although not super well. He wasn't saying what the people who repeat that quote today were saying. Actually, I think he was very prophetic. Imagine, in 2012, what he was saying was, we need to pay attention politically to cultural issues. Because in
Sure.
2012, it was very much that autopsy, right? The minute, like, we need to move away from these divisive cultural issues and focus on cutting taxes. And what
Yeah.
he was saying with that line is, good luck cutting your taxes. There's a 5 alarm fire in our culture. And you need to pay attention to it. He wasn't foreclosing political action on cultural issues. He was actually encouraging it. So I
Yeah.
think
Very fair. Yeah.
he is misread in that way. But that being said, I know exactly what you meant. There's a lot of people who use that phrase to say essentially that we need only to have cultural solutions to these problems. The solutions can't be political. They can't be legal, right?
Right.
They have to be cultural in some nebulous way. And with that, I certainly disagree. And in fact, um, Reagan, in his farewell speech, at the end of his farewell speech, he points to this problem, right? And gives the only answer that was available in the 1980s, right, in the late 1980s. But he says our spirit is back. One of the things he's most proud of during his presidency is that he's revived the American spirit, by which he means is kind of like cultural patriotism. Um, but we haven't reinstitutionalized it, is what he said. And he goes into this long piece of his speech where he talks about when he was growing up, that if your family didn't reinforce these values, first of all, most people's families reinforce these values at home. But if you didn't get it from your family, then you got it from school, because in school they were teaching these values. And if you weren't a very good student, then you could get a watered down version by watching TV. And the pop culture was actually like in alignment with these values. And he's saying none of these things are true anymore. Um, and that's a problem. But he ends, and he said, actually, not a problem. This is the biggest problem for our country and its future. However, he ends it by saying, "Well, I guess we're just going to have to discuss it around our dinner tables." And I think from the vantage point, no shade on Reagan at the time, but I think from the vantage point of 2023 now, that's clearly inadequate, right? This power is institutionalized, as we've been talking about. It's it's applied through our laws very directly, um, and it has enormous shifts on what the folks who repeat that quote from Breitbart mean by culture, right? I mean, just look at same-sex marriage. It's an unbelievable shift. Transgender issues is going to be just as fast, right? Right now, we feel like we have the cultural upper hand and there's a majority against it, but these institutional incentives do their jobs. Indoctrination works and incentives work.
Yeah.
I
I
guarantee
would.
you in
Yeah.
10 years, those polls are going to look very, very different, maybe even 5 years.
Yeah, it's foolish to think that conservatives have the upper hand on this. It's absolutely insane. That's not what's being taught in schools. That's not the culture that's being forced onto kids. They know what they have to say. They know what they have to affirm, and there's no way that in 5 to 10 years the next round of graduates that come out of universities and inherit those managerial positions are going to be anything but even more insanely radical on this stuff. So yeah, I think it's really really important for people to not pretend that there's some kind of silent majority, and again that the uh, uh, reality may eventually assert itself, nature may eventually make itself clear, but I think there's a long space between now and when that actually comes.
So this might be a difference between us, actually. I think there is a
Okay.
silent majority, um,
Okay.
but I think that silent majority is closing, right? So um, I think, again, this is very generational. And as long as boomers and Gen X are uh, still active voters, and by that I don't, yeah, anyway, and more importantly, like, Gen X is coming into its own. And I'm a millennial, but I'm like a fan of Gen X. As Gen X is coming into its own, Gen X is going to be the C-suite. We're going to have more Gen X politicians, and I think you can see a notable difference, for example, between Trump and DeSantis, in terms of, but not just DeSantis. Like, there's a whole crop of Josh Hawley, Tom Cotton. I think you'll see a big difference, and I think we'll have a lot of people in the Republican Party who are Gen X. Like, I think Gen X is going to swing quite heavily for the Republican Party in the foreseeable future and change what that party stands for. Um, So I think this is largely generational, but I think that gap is closing, right? If we wait until millennials, and it's not that far from now, right? The oldest millennials are just cresting 40, I think. Um, if we wait too much longer, like I really do think this is essentially a very important 2 to 7 years. And we're going to see whether these processes of democracy, this is what you're skeptical of, the process of democracy may actually still function, because I do think there's a silent majority out there right now. I don't think in 10 years we'll have a silent majority. And I think that is because, again, all the issues we're talking about, the incentive structure is incredibly powerful. So I think what's going to happen is you're going to see a revolt. And then we'll see whether essentially the political power structures that exist and the managerial structures that exist crumble in the face of that revolt, or just become more naked in exercising power. Like we'll move to a more explicit um, kind of tyranny than we have now. I don't know what the answer to that question is, but I still think it's a question.
Yeah, fair enough. As you noted, I'm less bullish on the prospects of that coming around. I think if the last 50 some years of shift don't really convince you that the public is in almost entirely malleable and that they're going to be able to produce increasingly consistent results, uh, I guess in the democratic process, I don't know, but like you said, the crucible will come in the next 10 years one way or another. I think that's right. Well, do you I don't know. Do you want to talk about the speaker throwdown? Is that too, I don't know. It feels boring to me, but do you want to get into? Do you have a thought on the drama on the GOP speaker battle right now?
Um, a little bit of one, which is that I think it's largely unimportant to the country.
Yeah.
So I guess that's the uh, I hmm, do I think it's so I think the underlying division is very important. I think we've seen it bubble up in the Republican Party repeatedly over the years. I sort of first joined politics during the Tea Party. I was a member of the several different Tea Party groups, sort of grassroots groups, and so on. Um, and fundamentally, there's a huge disconnect between the leadership of the Republican Party and the voters. Um, and I think much more than there's a disconnect between Democrats and the Democratic Party. And in fact, when people say that Democrats don't represent sort of left wing interests, I think they are just underestimating, or rather overestimating, how many voting Democrats actually agree with some of this cultural stuff,
Mhm.
or whether it's important to them. So I think the Democratic Party actually does a quite good job representing the interests of their voters. Not a perfect one, but a decent one. The Republican Party, there's a total disjoint there. And there has been for a long time. I mean, the first spike of this was Newt Gingrich um, in the 2012 primaries, I think, going after the media. He was like really one of the first person in the Republican Party to like really start to go after the media, and he got a huge spike of voters. Now, he didn't end up taking the nomination; Romney did, but um, he got a huge spike of voters, and it was very clearly his like finest moment in the primary. And I'm not saying Newt Gingrich is some kind of like anti-establishment figure, but he was the first to like basically directly take on the media and say like, why should we give you the time of the day? We know you hate us. You hate like the average American. That was a very popular message. The Tea Party also, I think, is misunderstood as purely about economic issues. That is not the Tea Party that I participated in. There's this cultural anxiety that fundamentally the leadership and the ruling class in this country is taking it in a direction that is fundamentally different than the American way of life, or the traditional American way of life. And then, of course, we had the Trump rebellion in 2016, right? I think these are all manifestations, and to some degree, this speaker fight is as well, although it's not clear to me that the replacement will be that much better,
Yeah, that's the
right?
big problem.
So
Yeah.
that's really what makes me kind of about this fight. Like, if we were talking about putting in somebody who is much more in line with Republican voters, then I would think this is actually of utmost importance. Um, but perhaps the fight itself is important in the sense that extracting a pound of flesh from leadership, I think, is itself a good lesson. Um, I also don't think like McCarthy wasn't the biggest problem. McConnell was the bigger problem. McCarthy is just obviously a non-ideological guy. He's not like on fire about any of these issues, but he did seem more willing to actually do the traditional job of speaker, which is wrangle coalitions, right? He wasn't totally ignoring conservatives. he was sitting down with them and trying to work on their concerns and so on. And sometimes they won and sometimes they lost. And he certainly wasn't one of our guys, but McConnell actively, McConnell would rather work with a Democratic majority and be in the minority than have the kind of Republicans that disagree with him elected. And
Yeah.
that's not an acceptable thing for a party head, right? Like the least we can expect of our leadership should be that they're partisan. He's not even strictly partisan.
Yeah, I think the pound of flesh from your leadership being the takeaway is probably the right one here. Again, not here to endorse this, democracy, but if you're gonna play this game, the Republican base has to learn to actually make their politicians deliver something for them. And not to run through the laundry list of embarrassing mainstream pundits who are doing this today, but like pretending that looking slightly disorganized while you force people in your party to actually care about what you want is more clownish than continually feeding the Democrats every single thing they want without almost any resistance is insane. It's absolutely insane. I really have a hard time understanding, like, the appearance of unity is would be great if the Republican Party had any interest in actually serving its base,
Right.
but they don't. And so telling me that unity is more important than forcing these people to the table and making them give you something is just absolutely ridiculous. But I wonder this, and there's many reasons why this happens, but I wonder if this is one of them. The ideological underpinning of government, of like the role government should play, I think is a big part of this, because Democrats, because they have no problem with the exercise of government power, are more than happy to offer their constituents like material benefit. Like, vote for me, there will be more money in your pocket. Vote for me and you will have a job. Vote for me and I will ensure that, healthcare, college, whatever, like these things will be delivered unto you. And even if they aren't perfectly done, like you said, the Democrats, at least on a pretty regular basis, provide some kind of actual material benefit for their voters. The Republican Party's idea is small government. We don't do anything, and so we don't. So when they're in power, they don't build anything that benefits their voters. They don't do anything that actually increases their material prosperity. They just don't do anything, and they certainly don't punish their enemies. That's something the left is very good at when they're in power. And so the left is just constantly ratcheting things because whenever they're in power, they are allowed the free hand to generate incentives for people to vote for them and to increase their power inside institutions. And the right is basically ideologically opposed to doing any of those things. And so they seem to lose the game over and over again.
I agree largely with what you're saying, and I think what you're pointing to is actually the professionalization of political benefit and patronage has been a disaster. I'm a proponent of the spoil system, right? I think that the 19th century spoil system was far more democratic and responsive to the will of the people, even as it generated a certain level of corruption, than the professionalization of the civil service. Because a lot of those benefits that you're talking about, and look no further, by the way, than student loan forgiveness, right? Which is a direct
Yeah.
handout to a key Democratic Party constituency, right?
Mhm.
Literally, we're going to write you a check. Um, I I think a lot of that is, first of all, implemented through the administrative state. A relatively small percentage of it is actually passed through Congress. So if you think about what the Democratic Party does in terms of elected officials, I think they're far less efficient at that game than the administrative state is. Right? There are literally millions of grants, half the NGOs. I mean, I've been pointing out for a long time that the Republican side is essentially privately funded, and all of the mess, whether it is called private or not, on the Democratic Party is heavily funded by the government. Universities depend as lifeblood on student loan programs funded by the government. They also get trillions in grants. Okay. Just about anything you can think of. Every NGO has like 6 different grants from all 3 levels of government: municipal, state, and federal. Right. Republican or conservative organizations do not have any of that. We're fighting on a completely uneven playing field. Particularly since the right has lost big business, right? Because there was some parity when big business was essentially funding the right, and the left was funded by government, right? But there's no parity at all now because big business is funding the left. So that's one point. So I agree with you on that, that we need to develop, in some cases, the only consistent patronage network on the right that I can think of is one that perhaps has yielded, again, very little benefit for the country, sadly. But I think the professional right, we're really good at identifying talented young people, giving them fellowships, paying them a comfortable salary to be able to do. We do this in the world of ideas. So we have found a way to duplicate the kind of patronage style part of universities, but absolutely not the pipeline into power, right? The graduates of think tank fellowships don't go on to rule the DOJ. So that link into power, that last piece has not happened. But more broadly about the chaos point, it really feels increasingly, and I've read, I feel like 1,000 different takes from 1,000 different people, actually pretty far range of the political spectrum, that something feels fundamentally broken in every aspect of not just American life, but even sort of in the West more broadly. And I think that chaos is just not reflected so directly, and people call us whatever, doomers, crazy, whatever, because that chaos is papered over by an enormous amount of wealth. And so I tend to think chaos reflected in our political institutions is a good thing insofar as it's reflecting the underlying chaos, right? Like, you can't get less accountable for chaos than losing a war and getting promoted.
Yeah.
So I would like to see those people get fired. I would like to see some chaos. I would like to see our political representatives fighting over these matters instead of pretending that everything is fine under the surface because we have so much money that we're able to lose a war in Afghanistan, right? And not suffer immediate massive consequences of that, except the people who fight it, right? Which is a 0.5% of people who are in the military are connected to military, right? But for most of us, we didn't feel the consequences of losing a war because we are so rich. That wealth won't perpetuate. And that's maybe to like tie it back to the Elon Musk thing, right? That wealth is not the natural state of the universe. Okay? We are going to lose that wealth over time if we squander it, and if 1/3 of our GDP or more is just ideological compliance that doesn't generate the kind of wealth that has allowed us to ignore reality and ignore the fundamental brokenness and chaos that we're living in. So, I mean, again, this could happen tomorrow or it could happen in 100 years. It matters very, very much when. So it's not meant to be like sort of a Zen thing, like things will work out. And also, things working out might just be that we are just conquered by some other people, right? Who don't buy into some of this stuff and just continue to raise warriors and live in a more like tangible economy. But so it's not really meant to be a comfort so much as a warning that maybe this Musk example is that important, because that wealth is dependent on things that we no longer do, or at least a large percentage of our society no longer does. And that cannot go on forever. So I don't know,
Yeah,
again, not necessarily a white pill, because it's like it could get much worse from here, but that kind of that idea that we should have unity, or we shouldn't have even like the kind of chaos over a Speaker of the House battle, is completely naive, right? Like, I'm glad to see the cracks appearing somewhat, because the faster we're going to have to actually deal with what's underneath.
Yeah, that's very right. I'm 100%. Dan Crenshaw was saying, anybody who's not for Speaker McCarthy, they're just an enemy now. And it's like, yeah, the faster we can get Republican establishment guys to just declare each other enemies and like and openly dismiss the interests of their voters and just continually show that conceit, I think that's really essential. Like, if the GOP is going to be of any value, it can only be of value after it's basically deconstructed itself pretty fundamentally. And I think the more often that can happen, the better. But that said, we have hit an hour, and I barely got into like half the stuff I wanted to get. But I think it's a good conversation. We've got some questions from the
Like
audience,
all
if you
women,
don't
I love
mind.
to hear the sound of my own voice.
Well, yeah, there you go. So that's why we're in the business, right? All right. So I've got some questions from the audience here, if you don't mind. Run through these real quick before we go. Let's see here. We've got QuirtzZZ7, $10 Canadian. Thank you very much. Debate shows and academic debates gained popularity in 2009 to 2014 as millennials came of age. Does this indicate a want of millennials, maybe Gen X influence? Also, love your authoring name, Inez Stepman. So yeah, that's interesting. We had it feels like there was maybe this is part of the new atheist time, or no, maybe this was lightly after, but it feels like there was an obsession with kind of having the debate shows, facts and logic. There was a far more interest in this during that time. Do you think there's a generational difference there, a shift that maybe brought that upon us?
It might be generational, and it also might be just I think this is more clear in art, actually, than in
Hmm.
I think maybe it's a function of the same impulse, but what we're seeing now is, again, I do think it's largely like Gen X and older millennials who are driving this, but the the institutions that produce this culture, right? They are becoming so incredibly boring, that you have a certain amount of, and I think it's always going to be a relatively small percentage of people who are just like, I cannot listen to this anymore. Even if they sort of agree with the fundamentals, it's just boring. In the same way that woke Hollywood, like the really formulaic woke movies always fail. The real power of the cultural left is when they manage to work in, a left-wing theme or two into a very like interesting character-driven story. And when they go to these like sort of woke, like direct woke, like sort of propaganda films, they
Mm,
fail, right? Because it's not interesting. And
right.
I think that might be part of this, right? I think there was a sort of, and the move into podcasting and long form media is very much, I think it's a very hopeful thing. I think it's a good thing that people are bored with what seems like the same talking points and like tomatoes being thrown back and forth. I do think that's a good thing. I do think there is some minority of people. Clearly, there are literally millions of people who want to listen to Joe Rogan for 3 hours, and all he
Yeah.
is intellectually curious, right? Like
Mhm.
that's it. Like I'm not a huge Rogan listener. I do listen from time to time, but all his great strength is obviously that he's just genuinely intellectually curious. And I do think there's a certain percentage of people who just crave that after the kind of incredibly rote, even if they don't have deep ideological objections, they're just sick of it because it's boring.
Yeah.
So
Have you seen the meme where it's Joe Rogan is like a barbarian king? He just brings the wise man before him and says, "Smart man, tell me why the water falls from the sky." Like just
it's
him
a good
doing that
description,
routine.
yeah.
Yeah, it's very effective. I think a big part of that is also found time. The fact that our society has moved to uh you have the technology where you don't have to sit down in front of the TV and dedicate 30 minutes or an hour to watching a news program, means that people don't have to have everything condensed into sound bites so they can move on to something. The fact that you can mow the lawn or lift weights or do laundry or drive and get all this stuff, I think facilitates people's ability to listen to those longer conversations. And the fact that the audience is fractured, right? It doesn't have to be talk radio, it doesn't have to be top 40, you don't have to appeal to every single person driving. You need to appeal to a specific subset of people who in drive time traffic want to learn more about the French Revolution or something like that. Like I think that really facilitates that as well, and why people are they're far more demand for long form than there was before. But
That
I do
that's
think it.
that's totally true, and that rings true to me personally. Like I am a huge proponent of the audio revolution because I
Mhm.
listen to a lot of this stuff, not just podcasting, but books and why exactly what you're saying. While I do other things, right? While I'm working out, while I'm doing chores, and it really has been an enormous, wonderful thing in my life. Like I've learned a lot. I feel like um So I'm a huge proponent of those things, and I think that's totally true. There is a negative side to cultural fracturing, right? Like
Mhm.
we don't have a pop culture anymore. Actually, I would argue like maybe Game of Thrones was the
Yeah,
only
a lot of
thing
people
the
say that
last
the
like,
last
and
yeah.
then maybe before that Sopranos. Although Sopranos was still very niche.
Mhm.
Even though I think it's much better. Don't get me wrong. I'm not comparing them in terms of like literary merit or artistic merit. I'm just we don't have that's really has been one of the consequences for good or ill of the internet, right? It's that no matter what weird little thing you're into, you can find the seven other people in the world who are into that same thing, which is on the one hand wonderful in community building and allows people to go deeply into something they are interested in with a community of fellows. It also fractures that space where we need to interact with people who are different from us, right?
Yeah.
So here I'm thinking like there are downsides to having this kind of pop culture, but the upside is everyone was watching Muhammad Ali, right?
Mhm.
Um, watching those fights in America, and that brings people together who are very different. Uh, and I think that that is also a force that we're now missing. We're completely sort of fractured culturally, and it makes it very difficult to build a nation. Right? It makes it more difficult to build a neighborhood, more difficult to build a nation, especially when people find out that they might have something more in common with someone in Timbuktu because they both love this like one weird thing. And in particular, when elites of different nations find out they have more in common with each other than they
Yeah.
do with their neighbors. And so I think there are downsides to this kind of fracturing, but it definitely has personal upsides.
Yeah, Mark Fisher's wrong about a lot of things because he was a communist, but he was right about this. Like his best observation was that the fact that all of these cultures are now available continuously, that all these different decades and eras of music and movies and all this stuff is simultaneously available, is that you don't have one forged shared culture anymore. People can escape into micro niche subcultures, or you can go back and just listen to metal from the 80s, or listen to pop music from the 90s, or only watch movies from the 60s, and you don't actually have to care about what your culture is producing now, because there's just this simultaneously existent backlog of culture that anyone can escape to and not actually interface with the real world, which is its own issue for sure.
It also completely breaks down this distinction between culture and counterculture, right?
Hmm.
And here I think Paulia was very prophetic. But there are things that have always happened, and here I think the best example is kind of sexual minorities, right? It's not that homosexuality is a new thing under the sun. It's not even a new thing under the sun that there are men who get their sexual thrills by dressing like women, right? This is very clearly a phenomenon in all societies virtually. Um, that the differences between the mainstream and the counterculture, right? We
Hmm.
had these countercultures, some of them very degenerate, and some of them producing some beautiful art, actually, right? Like, and I think, for example, gay life in the 1980s in New York City is very much an example of this, right? Where it's actually, I think that there is a benefit to those cultures existing as subcultures, as countercultures. But the problem is there's no barrier now between the mainstream and the counterculture, because every little faction has to be um, not in specifics, but like in essence endorsed by everyone. Everyone's little weirdness and identity. There are no weirdos anymore. You're not allowed to be like a freak or a weirdo or like and just exist outside of culture. Those things must be embraced by Delta,
Yeah.
right? And I think that is bad for both sides of the equation. Like I think it's bad when gay pride parades are endorsed by Delta. And I think it's actually bad not only for the children watching, but it's bad for gay culture when Delta endorses it and it becomes sort of bland and corporatized and loses that like that sense of rebellion and limitation of the rest of society that places barriers around it that therefore engenders a certain amount of creativity. And here I really sound like Camille Paglia, but so
Well, I think
second rate
it's
Camille
a
Paglia.
well, I think there is. I think there's an observable phenomenon there that I think a lot of people can understand. I mean, just ask all these subcultures that have been now co-opted by the gamer gates and the comic book gates, and all these different fandoms who, maybe live their whole life saying, "Oh man, I can't wait till someone makes a movie about my thing," and now the people who were the core audience of those things have been completely, derided and tossed out of their own subculture because that culture had to be, made safe and pasteurized and homogenized so that it could then be, elevated and served up to the wider culture, right? Like those niches are no longer allowed to exist with their own interests and their own standards. They have to be, all the indoctrination has to be poured into those areas so they can then be brought and made wide to everybody else. So I think there's a lot of truth there. Johan Richardson for $20 says, what role does demography play in changes in the young? If the portion of the young are less and less the long-term heirs of the first world civilization, will the odds be tilted against the preserving the first world social structures? I mean, that's a really good question. And I think there is definitely, an observable phenomenon of a lot of native people in, first world cultures saying, it's not worth, participating anymore, especially as, again, we see the incentive structure specifically created to say, actually, we're going to elevate everyone who isn't you, and you're going to have to, justify all of your actions in every situation that you didn't, transgress some new cultural faux pas while trying to do the job and preserve these different systems. I think there is an understandable, walking away of many people from the need to kind of maintain the systems that are holding up a culture that they no longer see themselves reflected in.
Yeah, I think that's true, but I think the answers are different to this question in the US versus Europe. So I think that that's because America is really, really assimilatory. And the problem is not so much. I guess maybe I depart from some people on the right. I don't think that America's ability to assimilate immigrants has actually gotten much worse. I think we're just simply assimilating them to a dominant ideology of America, which is wokeism. Like,
Mm-hmm.
um, I think that actually we are quite assimilatory still, and in fact, we're projecting that culture around the world because we do have an empire, and
Sure.
it's a cultural empire,
Yep.
and so now we are exporting this ideology just as we are assimilating our immigrants to it at home, and I tend to think like yes, you can talk about perhaps changing the demographics of the vote empowered specifically the Democratic Party that then passes these laws, but they're almost tangential within the party, right? That break from immigrant vote to like woke policies, it's running through a Democratic Party that's controlled largely not by by people who just came to this country, right? And so they might have some ideas about government programs and wanting benefits, and maybe don't have the same kind of culture of self-government as Americans have. But what's actually coming out on the other end, I think, has much less to do with immigrants, and in fact, is assimilating their children uh, aggressively. So in Europe, I think it's quite different. You have kind of the two extremes in Europe, where I would say, like for example, in France, you just have a large unassimilated minority to that France has very little interest in assimilating, but is now outbreeding them, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then in the UK, they've bent over backwards to assimilate their immigrants completely to the point where they like disavow everything about British culture, um, and have also not successfully, I don't think, assimilated their immigrants because they've just assimilated to
I was going to say
foreign
that's
cultures, right?
the inverse. They haven't assimilated anyone; they've been assimilated.
Yeah, so I think
Yeah.
these questions are quite different. So on the global scale, obviously, in the same vein as what can't go on forever won't.
Mm-hmm.
Eventually, some civilization will conquer another. I mean, um, if we don't continue to produce this much wealth, I think we will be conquered eventually. But on the sort of shorter time scale, I actually think this ideology and all of the power structures that we were talking about for the last hour, I think they are powerful enough to assimilate immigrants too. It's just assimilating it into something Americans from 40 years ago wouldn't recognize.
Sure, but I guess that doesn't really address the issue of those left behind by the assimilation, right? All those who are being pushed out of those positions because the structural incentives are to make sure that those assimilated peoples are moved into positions of power and in institutional structural advantage, right? So you're right. Like I think that's 100% correct that the U.S. is very good at this, but the people who are the victims of this are those who are being displaced by it, as it always is, and those who are constantly the same people who are being dismissed. They took our jobs as the joke, like, but yeah, but you don't have your jobs anymore. So actually, that is a problem, right? So I think you're right that the U.S. is very good at this point, but that only emphasizes the issue. It doesn't solve it.
Well, and what you see is the needs, right?
Yeah.
You see people drop out. In fact, so Nicholas Eberstadt has some great work on this, but the rise of working age, and it is primarily men, right? For all kinds of reasons, these developments have been better for women, at least materially. Have been better for women materially than for men. But what we're seeing is working class men of primary working age dropping out and largely either existing on welfare benefits or on side income that is illegally generated, and largely getting dying deaths of despair. Right? I
Hmm.
mean, getting addicted to pain medication or becoming alcoholics, and in some sense, that's just like that's just good for not for us, but for this managerial class, right? Because this is the same. uh, Silicon Valley's solution to this is give UBI, right?
Yep.
Give people UBI, give them porn, give them give them pain meds easily, legalize all the drugs, and let them die deaths of despair at 45, and they won't cause us any trouble.
Yep, I think that is unfortunately very much their approach. Well, Skeptical Panda, I'm sorry, we've just failed you here, but hi Inez and Auron, good to see another based guest on the show. Remember, no black pills. Well, we try to keep as positive an outlook as possible, but if you're looking for no black pills, you might have come to the wrong
I
to the
I
wrong
still
place.
I still think that there could be a populist revolution in the United States. So here's your white pill
There you go. Okay.
history stuff. I still think that's possible. There have been, in my estimation, four successful populist revolts in American history. The first being under Andrew Jackson, and that resulted in something that I think is very relevant to our times: rotation in office, meaning bureaucrats. And it started the patronage system that lasted throughout most of the 19th century, was very effectively used by the Lincoln administration, but was then derisively called the spoil system. Okay. But that started under Jackson. It was a major, and also Jackson killed the bank, right? So two major structural victories of the Jacksonian populist movement that had effects that lasted for a century. I think the next one was under FDR, really. And that had incredible structural effects and lasting effects, right? You're talking about the creation of Social Security, the creation of the welfare state in large part, the total transformation of the constitutional system of the United States. Um, so I think a lot of those things were bad, but that was a lasting impact that we see today, right? And then the last two, so I think the jury's still out about the last two. Is the Reagan Revolution was a populist revolution. I think that largely it was successful in that it placed a president in the White House. I think it was largely unsuccessful in terms of changing the trajectory. It basically stopped everything, but didn't, as Reagan said, didn't really reinstitutionalize anything, and the institutions continued to drift left and exercise power, and now we are where we are. And I also, obviously, the jury's still out on 2016. It seems like it failed to me, but the point being, these movements have succeeded in American history. They have made structural changes, and I think some of the structural changes that would mark it as successful for me would be some kind of serious knife in the heart of the university system as a pipeline to power, right? And I think that could come in a variety of different policy ways. My own personal sort of thing that I'm stumping for right now is to use the student loan crisis to heavily tax the universities to pay off student loans. Uh,
Hmm.
and I think that has a lot of benefits, but one of them is that it would be very expensive for universities and make it very difficult for them to continue on the trajectory that they're on. Um, and another thing is we like what I would call a success is some kind of gutting of the administrative state, or at minimum exerting political control over the administrative state, so that when a president who has populist concerns or orientation, like Donald Trump, is elected, that he actually does control the power of the state. And I think that could come through merit reform in terms of like being able to fire people. Trump's famous Schedule F policy, but it applies only to about 50,000 people at the top. There are 2.8 million civilian bureaucrats. But some kind of serious gutting of the administrative state, and then some kind of either gutting or convincing away from this current path of tech and woke capital. So those would be, I think, three, and I'm sure you could add some more of that, but I would say that progress or like structural change on those three sectors, I would consider that a success. And I think we could set ourselves up in such a way that the American Republic can kind of digest younger millennials and Gen Z as a generation, with certain structural changes that make limitations on how much they can wield their power. And then obviously we have to stop the pipeline on the other end. So you have to get control of the education system. But anyway, I think it's possible. It's an uphill battle, but I do think it's possible. I don't think it's like, I mean, Americans are pretty, I don't want to swear, pretty remarkable people in the history of the world. Still, the fact that every single institution, including me, I didn't vote for anyone in 2016. But every single institution in American life told every single American relentlessly that you're a bad person if you vote for Donald Trump, and they did. The American middle class is not a bunch of Russian peasants. They are used to having a certain standard of living. They are used to having a certain amount of control over their lives. And I do think there will be a pretty substantive rebellion against the direction of this country. Whether or not it succeeds, I don't know. But I do think there will be some kind of real teeth rebellion at some point, because Americans aren't used to. I think to a large degree, Americans are not used to being treated like serfs.
I believe that before COVID. I have a harder time justifying that belief now, but I hear you. The solutions are the things you identified as victories are certainly correct. I think those are all valuable things that would make a significant difference. Ben G here for $5. Nothing has changed for the positive with the Republican Party since the events that Sam Francis talks about in The King Holiday. I know that essay is in Beautiful Losers, but I've of course I've read it at some point. I just don't have all the points of that essay to mind. I wish I did, so I could give you more of an answer on that right away, but I can't immediately remember all of the points he's made in there. I mean, I have a general idea of what he said, but I can't really go through all of them for you there. Sorry about that, Ben, but I appreciate it. Let's see.
I don't know it either, so I can't can't comment.
Yeah, like I said, I read it somewhere in the middle of Beautiful Losers, but I can't remember all the points at the moment. MyTube for 199, thank you very much. The right loses because it lacks vision and spine. Well, that is certainly true. I think there are people. I think also vision and spine were beaten out of the right on a pretty regular basis. I think the excommunication of many thought leaders was intentional, and the selling of kind of a controlled opposition was. Has been there for a while. So I don't think that's a unique feature of the right so much as something that was, desired. But I do think that is a big problem for the right. And I think you are seeing people recognizing that problem. I think there are people actively taking action. The fact that you even have a fight over a speaker with the right now probably means that there are people taking notice of that. But you are right that that is a very consistent issue. Let's see here. Emergent perspective for $10. Do you think the internet allowing woke ideas to go way off the rails, i.e. Tumblr, may have backfired? Would the elite have preferred to go slowly via MSM evening news deployment mechanism? Possibly. So again, speaking of Sam Francis, this is something that Francis talks about in Leviathan and Zen Enemies. He says that basically the managerial class and the left vanguard had more or less the same desires, they had the same end goals, but that the vanguard wanted to go far too fast. The managerial elite realized that they needed to boil the frog slower, And so that's why they looked like enemies when they were actually allies. And that's why the Vanguard has become more and more okay where the manager elite are, because they've kind of caught up with the eventual goals of the Vanguard. And that's why it seems like there's less tension between, say, like the corporate press and left wing Vanguard movements. I think they're okay. I think the at this point the corporations and most of the managers have bought in. They've drank the Kool-Aid on the woke stuff. They probably still don't want to completely kill the golden goose with this. They are holding back things some, but I think at this point they're kind of up to speed with the cultural revolution, and so maybe they would have preferred to have more of a slow drip, but they haven't wasted much time in kind of onboarding a lot of this stuff, which is why we have kind of the corporate bloat of wokeness and patronage networks that we do today.
The left is also really good at taking essentially plateau moments for the radicalism of whatever they've done to be absorbed by the American public and to absorb a
Mhm.
backlash. Here I'm thinking about more public policy than like internet versus traditional media, but I mean, you can look at it as there's been a backlash against each one of these major structural changes, quite powerful ones that elected Republicans, and now we're back to the uselessness of doing that. But those changes have not been institutional, and the left is very, very good at. I think, and I don't want to imply even that it's like somebody sitting at the top thinking like, we just need to absorb this, but because they have institutional power, and the right doesn't, they have the advantage of time, right?
Mhm.
If we freeze everything right now, we pass no new policy, nothing happens, they win. So I think that's the advantage of owning the institutions. Yeah.
Yep. All right. So, Douglas, you have a very long name, Douglas. So I'm just going to go with Douglas there. Thank you very much for your donation. It sounds like a fancy way of saying biolinism is a thing. Yeah, I'm not sure exactly when you entered that remark, so I'm not sure exactly when you referenced that. But yeah, that is definitely something that you could probably categorize in this discussion. Thank you very much. And then Dante's uh, why can't I say this now? Uh, Kakistocracy. There we go. I did it. Thank you for your donation.
Kekistocracy. So
Huh?
I thought it was kekistocracy.
Well,
That was
from the Greek,
yeah,
meaning,
yeah,
yeah,
yeah.
no.
No, no, it's more legit than that. I thought it was a joke on.
It is. It is. Do you think the public will comply if lockdowns are imposed again? Yeah, I think they will.
Maybe that's the difference. I don't. I think nothing has trashed, like openly trashed, the power of the institutions and made it more brittle as much as this.
Mhm.
Even in New York City, where I live, right? I think it would be very, very difficult to reimpose lockdowns. Maybe not impossible, but I mean, even trying to reimpose a mask mandate, I see largely failing in New York City. Now, I think it would probably be possible in Washington, D.C. and in my hometown of San Francisco. Yes, but we have entire states now that would. I mean, I think pandemic is again a black swan event, and I think that largely people more or less trusted their institutions, even as they were disappointed over time in this kind of quiet way. But I think the pandemic really showed the rot, and I would be surprised if there's uniform lockdowns. You might see them in like one place or another, but I would be really surprised to see them broad based. And maybe I'm wrong, but we'll see which one of us is if the white pill or the black pill version wins.
Well, I think you're right that it's a mask off moment. Not to create any puns there. I think you're right that it is a moment that reveals the rot, and does fracture faith in the institutions. And in that case, in that way, it is that part of it is valuable. But if do I think that you could see that kind of thing attempted to be reapplied and probably successfully reapplied in a good chunk of the country? I do think that there probably is still enough institutional momentum to get that through one more time. But you are right that every time they do try to do that, the attempt to flex that kind of raw power does cost them something.
Well, and the federalist system is going to help us here. And
Yes, you're right about that.
if you compare the responses in European countries to the United States, I think theirs is better in some ways and ours is better in other ways. Their experts are a little bit more legit in the sense that when the data strongly moved in one direction, there was some acknowledgement of that in the professional structures. For example, and here, for example, get out of Europe, in Israel, right? Israel went really, really hard on lockdowns. They instituted vaccine mandates up to the second booster, and then publicly announced this isn't working. We're rolling all of this back. So in that sense, their expert class, I think, is still a little bit more actually scientific, which is not to say that it solves some of these deeper questions of political power and judgment. In America, our expert class is worse, and more ideological and more useless. And I don't think you'll ever see our expert class walk back anything like that. I don't think you'll ever see an announcement like that in America, where you have like the head of the CDC saying we screwed it up.
Yeah.
On the other hand, the federalist system here means that we have a counterexample. The fact that Florida exists is incredibly important because now we have a counterexample to say, because otherwise, if everybody does the same thing, right, you have no way of knowing what the outcomes would be if you had done it differently. But the fact that we have counterexamples and the fact that the federalist system did hold up in this largely, right, where you had very different paths taken in different states. That I think like Americans largely lock down a lot less than most European countries, on average. So anyway, I think the federalist system was an enormous advantage to us in this. I think it really proved the wisdom of the federalist system.
Well, as a Floridian, I certainly benefited from that, and very grateful for its restrictions in that way. All right, guys. Well, I think we got through all of the questions. Want to go ahead and thank everyone for coming by. Inez, where can everyone find your work? Do you have anything exciting people can check out coming up? Anything like that?
You can find my work at iwf.org, along with those of my colleagues at Independent Women's Forum. And I also am affiliated with a bunch of other folks. You can find most of my stuff on Twitter. Honestly, I tweet a lot. I'm too much. And it's at Inez Feltscher, Feltscher, but you can put in Stepman as well. That's my married name. Actually, maybe now I can change it because I wasn't allowed to change the @ handle.
Okay.
Because I was going to lose the check mark. I got it when like they were actually still giving check marks to the right. Yeah, maybe I can change it now, but that's my @ handle. And you can find a lot of my work at various sort of conservative outlets.
Excellent. So make sure to check that out, guys. And of course, if this is your first time here, make sure that you are subscribing. And also remember, guys, that you can now listen to the show as a podcast, not just as the live stream. So if you want to go and subscribe, it's on all the major podcast platforms. Make sure when you do, you leave that rating and that review. That really helps a lot with all the algorithms and everything. I also went ahead and released my latest chapter of the Total State. Chapter 5 just went up on the Substack. So if you want to go over there, you can read the whole thing. That one's free for everybody. So if you want to read the latest chapter there as well. Oh, we have one more chat that came in right here. Let's see. Oh, I see we have Hans Hermann Hoppe fan here. Phil, $10. Any right-wing political pan win that does not include the physical removal of post 65ers is a loss. Yeah, I hear you, but I don't know that that's in the cards. I don't know about the prospect of that one, buddy. But anyway, all right. So let's go ahead and wrap this up, guys. Thanks again, everyone, for coming by. And as always, I'll talk to you next time.
Thank you for having me on.